Hey JC, this is just a hopefully not too long video response to your latest video on audio, where you're comparing the difference between digital and analog audio sounds and drawing some conclusions. To some degree I'm in full agreement with, and to another degree I think you may have misrepresented the case a bit. Hopefully you won't see this as a troll, because it's certainly not intended to be. It's intended to be just part of the discussion. And before we get into that, I fully support, I'm on the other side of the planet, as you can probably tell from my outrageous accent, and I fully support your statements regarding everybody in the New York area and the Jersey Shore area and, well, basically the whole eastern seaboard of the US and Canada. It's a terrible thing that's happened there, and I really hope that they can get back on their feet quickly, because, you know, nobody deserves that in any circumstances. And the same for the people in the Caribbean and Haiti and those sorts of places who were equally affected. However, getting back to the subject at hand, I agree entirely with you that digital and analog sound can sound totally different. If you're in a studio and you've got lots and lots of dollars worth of equipment, then you're going to have pretty good ears to be able to tell the difference, as you pointed out. I mean, you know, recording at 96K with 32-bit quantization is basically going to be indistinguishable, I believe, to most analog mastering. And it's the mastering phase that I think we should, you know, at least think a little bit about. I have, I guess, a reasonable playback system in a suboptimal room, and my vinyl playback consists of a Technics SL120 with an SME 3009 Series 2 Mark II improved arm with a Shure V15.3 cartridge installed therein. So it's not a bad vinyl playback system. It doesn't go into a terribly good RIAA compliant preamp, but it's not bad. I think that both the arm and the cartridge are getting past their use-by date now, and really, you know, I'm going to have to look at replacing one or both. I'm getting a lot of splatter and sibilance and those sorts of things from certain pressings, and it's annoying. That said, the vast majority of the music that I listen to these days comes off digital. Basically, it's either digitized LPs, well, it's mp3 or mp4 downloads. That's possibly acceptable to me because, like all of us, I'm getting old, and as you get old your ears break. But realistically, my ability to critically tell the difference between a really good digital recording and a really good analog recording is decreasing. However, there's a few things that I think we need to point out. You did a very good job of demolishing the digital signal path, and there is absolutely no question that a poorly constructed digital signal path, or a poorly used digital signal path, be that at the mastering stage or be that at the pressing stage, and let's face it, CDs aren't hi-fi quality, I guess, or be that at the playback stage, is going to result in suboptimal audio. That said, most people's listening rooms are suboptimal anyway, and the simplest solution to most of the problems they encounter is to actually improve the quality of the listening room, rather than improving the quality of the equipment that they're playing back, whatever it is they're playing back, be it digital or analog. I think, intentionally or unintentionally, and I'm assuming it's unintentional because I have a lot of respect for the stuff that you've done, glossed over, didn't mention, didn't go anywhere near similar imperfections that exist in an analog signal path at the mastering stage or the playback stage or whatever. Really, very few LPs are cut direct to master. Most artists don't like doing that for obvious reasons. Most recording engineers find it a pain in the arse to do that for obvious reasons. And so there's at least a single analog step between the microphone and what comes out of a cutter head, and that can, regardless of whether it's digital or analog, but I'll play the analog card, that can and will introduce some level of signal alteration, possibly degradation. Mix desks in studios have, for a very, very, very long time, included effects outs and all those sorts of things, and they're there so that you can either digitally or analog, if we go back to the 70s, purely analog, affect the quality / sound of the signal that you're recording. That can either be done very well or it can be done very badly, and there's examples of both. I don't think we need to go into examples of both, but the point is that the signal path is significantly more complex than a microphone plugged into a cutter head, or a microphone plugged into a 9624 digitizer. And as a consequence, at the mastering stage, you can really stuff up the sound of a recording. Similarly, at the playback stage, you can really stuff up the sound of a recording if you have the world's best pressing and you play it back on a subpar cartridge sitting in a subpar arm, sitting on a subpar turntable, being played back through a at best consumer quality preamp, then it doesn't really matter how good the original recording was. What you're going to get is coming out of whatever it is that you're playing it on is going to be not what the engineers that recorded it intended you to hear, i.e. the AM radio effect that you mentioned. Engineers like the Yamaha NS1s or whatever it is that they're using these days, and they have a particular sound, and most people don't have that. Some people spend several $100,000 on speakers that don't sound anything like what they're listening to was mastered on, and so what they're hearing isn't actually what the recording engineers / artists intended them to hear. You mentioned the science of psychoacoustics. As you rightly mentioned, it was pioneered in Bell Labs initially for the express purpose of working out how cheaply they could send audio over copper wire. It's obviously expanded a lot since then. mp3, mp4 and later lossy compression algorithms, its current incarnation in the audio world, I would suggest. That said, psychoacoustics have been used in the analog world certainly since I was playing in the analog world. The leading proponent of psychoacoustic processing were Dolby Laboratories and DBX, where Dolby, well, prior to that really, there was the RIAA themselves, before they decided to devolve into something that does little more than sue people. They actually did some decent technical work and worked out how to record bass on an LP, decent bass on an LP, and they came out with a thing called an RIAA equalization curve, which has to be matched very, very, very precisely by your playback equipment, in the same way, I guess, as your playback equipment needs to match clocks that were used to digitize recordings. And if the RIAA curve doesn't match perfectly whatever was used to drive the cutter head, then you're again going to introduce distortions in the signal path. So again, there's another place that you can put purely in the analog world. You can easily put distortions and lack of fidelity. As I said, my own personal RIAA preamp isn't ideal, I don't think. but I'm not going to go out and spend as much money as the audiophile community thinks I should spend to get an RIAA preamp that is exactly right. Most RIAA preamps introduce phase distortion across the audio spectrum. That may or may not be audible. In the vast majority of cases it's not, but it's there. And so phase distortion, harmonic distortion that you're going to get out of every point in an analog signal chain, certainly that exists in studio equipment, albeit hopefully at subaudible levels, will add up, and it will be digitized as well as, or as badly as it will be transmitted to an LP cutter head or a tape head. And both of those pieces of equipment in and of themselves introduce distortion. They just do. They're producing a physical analogue of an audio signal. They're not perfect pieces of engineering by any stretch of the imagination. They're pretty damn good, but they're not perfect. And as a consequence, they're going to introduce distortion in the same way as a really, really, really good digitization system is going to introduce distortion. You mentioned recording hot in the digital world. You record hot in the analog world too, because you want to avoid the noise floor. Admittedly, the noise floor can be very low, and you don't have to record as hot as you arguably do in the digital world, although if you're using 32-bit quantization, you really don't have to. 32-bit quantization gives you plenty of room to adjust recording levels to suit whatever it is that you're recording and get the sorts of results that hopefully you're after. Oh, excuse the unshaven, unkempt look. I'm at home at the moment, recovering from a disease. So, yeah, I'm at work, and as a consequence have been a bit slack in terms of shaving. Entirely beside the point. One thing I will take definite exception to was your description of WOW. My understanding of WOW is not a mismatch between recording and playback equipment speeds. It's a very slow variation in playback and or recording equipment speeds, typically seen on turntables, which is why WOW and Flutter, and particularly WOW, I always found was something that mattered. And it's very interesting to see, I think, that turntables produced these days, for example, an Audio Technica LP120, I think that's what they call them, which looks just like a Technics SL1200, has WOW and Flutter specifications at least an order of magnitude, possibly 2 orders of magnitude worse than those that were produced in the 70s. I mean, you'd have thought we could have got technology a bit better, but we obviously haven't. It's very, very, very strange. Fortunately, you whack a nice big massive cast aluminium platter on and both of them become effectively inaudible simply because of the mass of the platter. Tape, on the other hand, is an entirely different issue. Cassette tape, the 1 7/8 inches per second that cassettes ran at made them particularly susceptible to both. When you were running up at 15 inches per second on decent stereo tape gear, it became less of an issue simply because of the physics of spinning tape reels. And yes, I consider that to be the analog equivalent of jitter. But they both exist, they're both issues. They exist to a greater or lesser degree depending on your playback equipment and or your mastering equipment. That doesn't mean we shouldn't care about them. We obviously should care about them. But I don't think that either of them are going to hugely impact what you can hear. As I said, yes, aliasing's an issue if you record at low bit depths. If you're recording at what CDs provide, then yes, you're definitely going to have aliasing issues. If you're recording at 24-bit or 32-bit depths, realistically you're not. Or at least that's been my experience. And I've had a little bit, not anything like your experience. I'm not even going to pretend that I have, but I have had some experience in both video and audio recording, and I do care at least a little bit about the quality that comes out. This audio is being recorded on a Rode NTG2. It's not an NTG3 because I don't have an unlimited budget, and if there's some wind noise coming through, I have done my best to minimise that with a dead cat, but on the mic, It's rapidly approaching summer on this part of the planet, and it's a bit warm, so I do have an overhead fan running. My apologies for that if that's causing some background noise. To sum up, yes, I agree entirely with your premises that the digital recording path and the digital playback path has a lot of issues with it, and that a good analog system can outperform a mediocre digital system. I would suggest, however, that an analog system taken end to end from the source transducers, the microphones, through a fully analog mastering process where you're using analog signal processing on mix desks, which will introduce their own noise, their own harmonic distortion, their own intermodulation distortion, because not everybody's using pure Class A amps and all those sorts of things, will also add a bunch of audio imperfections, and they will be less, they might sound nicer, I think. Basically, analog audio imperfections don't sound as bad as digital audio imperfections. Doesn't mean they're not there, it just means that they sound better. You really have to have bad levels of harmonic or intermodulation distortion, and or you really have to be recording hot and doing some fairly serious clipping to make analog sound bad. You don't have to work quite as hard at it to make digital sound bad for a whole bunch of reasons. By the same token, if you take an appropriate level of care on a digital signal path, and that's recording at a reasonably high bit rate, 24 at least, 32 is good, and a reasonably high sampling speed, 192k is a good number, then what you'll end up doing, I suspect, is recording very, very, very high quality analog distortion, because at some point you do have a whole bunch of analog transducers sitting between you and whatever you're recording, their microphones, their preamps, they're all the stuff that you can't get away from, and you will record very high quality analog distortion, and that will sound better than recording very low quality digital distortion. Poorly produced MP3s, for example, sound like crap. Well-produced MP3s, or more to the point, well-produced MP4s, can sound virtually indistinguishable from their, to me, and this is purely a subjective video, to me, can sound virtually indistinguishable from the source media. You need to record them well, you need to record them with lots and lots and lots of bandwidth, you need to record them with lots and lots and lots of bit depth, you need to record them with, you need to do it properly. But you need to do recording properly if you're going to get a good result. You need to do whatever you're doing properly if you're going to get a good result. The fact that people choose not to, the fact that we're engaged in loudness wars in studios, for God's sake. I mean, I thought that died in the 80s. But the fact that we're now back in loudness wars in remastering is just virtually criminal, because we're taking the best or analog sources that we had, we're racking up the volume on a mix desk, and then we're recording it, and the result is at best suboptimal at times. In summary, yes, I agree with you. You can get really, really, really bad sounding digital audio. I disagree with you that analog is by default a better technology. I think it's horses for courses. I think you can do really well with either. Like it or not, the world's gone digital. We just, I guess, have to live with that. I think that my basic issue with what you put up was that there's a presumption that the analog signal path is in some way pure. It isn't. It's got all sorts of places where things can go wrong, right down, and most importantly, as far as most people are concerned, right down to the final transducers and the final electronics in the chain. An Audio-Technica 120 will sound different to an Audio-Technica 95, which sounds entirely different to a Shure M97. Yeah, I think that's their current, which sounds entirely different to blah blah blah. Now, they're all playing exactly the same analog grooves. They're all feeding exactly the same preamplifiers, power amplifiers and speakers, but they sound different. The reality is that analog transducers sound different. Speakers sound different. Even analog amps sound different. That's not necessarily a bad thing, it's just a thing. And digital stuff sounds different. Again, it's not necessarily a bad thing, it's just a thing. And I think that my take on your video was that you highlighted all the things that can go wrong in a digital signal path, but entirely didn't for an analog signal path. And your series on trying to find your favourite cartridge, I think, highlighted the fact that analog signal paths, all other things being equal, can be very different if you just change one element. The same is true, obviously, with digital, but I think that some balance is a good thing. And I'm certainly not trying to troll, I'm just putting forward my view, and that is that I don't think you're entirely balanced in what you said. I'm trying to add, I guess, constructively to the whole discussion around the difference between digital and analog audio. I have several hundred LPs that get fairly regular use. Well, less regular than they used to, but nevertheless. And I wouldn't get rid of them for anything. So, I mean, I like what comes out of my analog sources, and I also like what comes out of my digital sources, assuming that the digital sources are well built. Happy to look at the faults and also the pluses on both sides. Anyway, this has rambled on for way long enough. I'll quit here so as not to bore you to tears. And yeah, I'll talk to you later. Okay, bye.